Welcome back to the Complete History of Coffee, Episode 28, Age of Espresso. Grab your favorite espresso beverage and let's get started. Okay, today we're going to be walking through how to make a shot of espresso. So to start, we're going to go ahead and grind our coffee. Next, we're going to tamp our espresso. And then once your coffee is tamped in the portafilter, you go ahead and lock it into place. And then we pull our double shot of espresso. Today we're doing a pea berry coffee from Caribou Coffee. I really like pea berry. In general, it's going to be a lighter coffee. Let's see. It smells very sweet. Kind of nutty notes. I feel like I'm getting almost a little bit of like fruity. Let me see. Very smooth coffee, very well balanced. Slight acidity, a little bit of bitter. Pretty ideal for a espresso, I would say. When last we left continental Europe, coffee was the primary drink of World War II, and much of this was in fact coffee substitutes due to wartime embargoes and lack of supplies. Even after the war, coffee was still a scarce commodity, and was in fact used as a form of currency on the European black market because of its high value at the time. But by 1956, things turned around, and coffee was being imported more than before the war. In fact, imports shot well past this by 1960. France was importing 2.6 million bags a year from its colonies in Africa, half of which was low-quality Robusta beans. As an interesting note, all of this Robusta coffee actually led French roast to take off. Although an already well-established roasting method by this point, it would take another decade for French roast to truly take hold in France. Beyond now using Robusta beans, we see a further decline in this period of the coffee dark ages, as most Europeans were shifting to industrial roasted coffee rather than roasting at home. And some were even beginning to enjoy instant coffee as a result of serving in the war, or from lack of coffee supplies for those at home during the period of rationing. However, there was one beacon of hope out there. Let us set the stage. Two cafes, both alike in dignity, in fair Turin, where we lay our scene. From ancient taste churns to new machinery, where simple coffee doth make hands unclean. That was, of course, my take on the prologue of Romeo and Juliet. And for all the English majors out there, yes, I stayed true to iambic pentameter. But for everyone who didn't grow up doing theater, let's see what this all means for coffee. Essentially, our prologue sets up the scene in Italy, where we find a new growing culture emerging, espresso. The precursor to the espresso machine was created by Angelo Moriando in Turin, Italy. This was a steam-powered coffee machine patented in 1884 as a, quote, new steam machinery for the economic and instantaneous confection of coffee beverages, end quote. In other words, a machine which can quickly make coffee. However, if you remember back 10 episodes ago, I talked about the history of espresso, as starting with Luigi Bezzetta. That's because Angelo's machine was more of a quick coffee brewer than an espresso machine, but also because his machine has been largely forgotten from history, likely due to poor marketing. So our story takes place with the true birth of espresso, Bezzetta's machine out of Milan in 1901. Bezzetta was a manufacturer and maker of liquors, who introduced improvements to Angelo's design, such as adding a portafilter and multiple brewheads. His machine was still relatively slow compared to today, but it did make a single serving of coffee, which resembled espresso. The problem was his machine relied on an open flame to heat the water, which resulted in inconsistent temperatures and, by extension, inconsistent shots of espresso. Bizetta, like Angelo before him, did not have the greatest marketing, and so his machine was largely unknown. However, his machine was improved on and marketed with the help of our next main character to the story, Desiderio Pavani, who purchased the patent for the machine around 1903. His company introduced the pressure release valve, which stopped the hot coffee from splashing onto baristas, which I can personally say I'm grateful for. But even more importantly, the two men worked together to create the steam wand, which is the very component used to this day to steam milk into hot lattes. They then introduced the world to espresso at the Milan Fair in 1906. Shortly thereafter, Desiderio's company La Pavani began mass production of the Ideale espresso machine, and Pizzata faded into the background. The name Ideale, being spelled like ideal with an E at the end, was used because Pavani believed his espresso machine was the ideal way to drink coffee. Over the next decade, Pavani dominated the espresso scene, but it was largely limited to Milan and the surrounding area. Even as his machine evolved, it was still only able to produce at most 2 bars of atmospheric pressure, meaning it was extremely slow. Keep in mind, 2 bars of pressure is just a little less than double the amount of pressure felt at sea level. As such, it took about 1 whole minute per espresso to pull. For context, a modern espresso machine produces shots in around 20 to 30 seconds. This resulted in a rather bitter coffee, and because of how hot the steam was when extracting the coffee, it was also burnt tasting. Going into our second act, we bring Pavani's greatest rival into our story, Pier D'Alessio Arduino. He ran a larger workshop than Pavani and wanted to innovate the machine even further. However, the reason he's important for us is because he was the first person to use their business and marketing skills to push espresso beyond Milan. He hired an artist to create an ad which showcased the speed and efficiency of espresso, capturing the attention of those around Europe and causing espresso to expand across the continent. During the 1920s and 30s, espresso bars began popping up. However, espresso wasn't a mainstream Italian drink until after World War II. That is, until our next major step in the journey of espresso, which comes with the inventor, Achille Gaggia. He began working at his family's coffee shop in 1930, Cafe Achille, located in Milan, of course. Shortly before the outbreak of the war, he filed a patent for his own coffee machine. The war, however, led to reduced access to coffee in Italy. People were stuck with coffee substitutes and watered down coffee. Even espresso began to be made with chicory. So we find the world entering the dark age of coffee, and only one man can turn it all around. But can he save the world from instant coffee? Will espresso ever be the same again? Before we can answer these questions, it's time for a brief intermission from our play to let our audience have a little coffee break. Now, as we jump back in at the start of Act 3 and instant coffee is taking off around the world, we have our Deus Ex Machina. This god machine was in fact Gaggia's lever-driven espresso machine, which launched the world into the age of espresso. Why was this so important? Well, because as we talked about previously, this allowed espresso to be pulled at 8 to 10 bars of atmospheric pressure, allowing for a much faster and consistent shot of espresso. It's also where we get the term pulling a shot of espresso, from a barista literally pulling the spring-loaded lever down to create additional pressure. This modern machine could only hold 1 ounce of water in the cylinder of the lever, leading to a standardized shot size. And the faster pull time introduced the crema on the shot of espresso. The crema is the top layer of espresso, sitting atop the body and the heart at the bottom. And it is often described as bitter and harsh in flavor. It seems counterintuitive thinking about these new machines adding a new layer of bitter, harsh tasting coffee, while older espresso makers produced an overall more bitter cup of coffee. But this is because the slower extraction time of older machines over extracted the less desirable parts of coffee, producing a much more bitter cup of espresso overall. And people of the time were even suspicious of this new lightly colored layer on their espresso, until Gaggia coined the term cafe creme to convince patrons his espresso was of such high quality it produced its own cream. Kind of gives Eric the Red vibes, like naming the country of Greenland in a way that made people think it's super green and definitely not icy. So, closing out our play, we have our epilogue. In it, we find the final step in the evolution of espresso with Ernesto Valente's machine, the FEMA E61. As the name suggests, it was invented in 1961. Importantly, it used a motorized pump to provide the force of the lever which baristas previously had to pull. And it introduced heat exchangers to keep the water at a standard temperature. Now, of course, this is not truly the final step in the evolution of espresso, but for the purpose of our play, it serves as a fitting end. Now that we have a good idea of espresso's evolution in Italy, let's touch on coffee more broadly in the country. Unlike much of the world where coffee saw a dark age following World War II, Italy saw a boom. 3,000 roasters popped up, all competing for control of the market. During the 1950s and 60s, Italy's urban areas grew in size as people moved to the city, away from rural areas. This meant right as espresso cafes were taking off, there was now a sudden influx of people into towns to drink such beverages. So, this period saw a rapid growth of espresso bars, especially as a drink to have on your feet. This was due to a law from 1911 which placed a cap on the amount of money an establishment could charge for a cup of coffee without table service. So, walking up to order your coffee and drinking it while standing at the counter meant a cheaper cup of coffee. Espresso bars were social hubs for people to gather together on a daily basis. In fact, it was quite common for people to stop by multiple times a day for an espresso. The most popular cafe drinks were, of course, straight up espresso, followed by a macchiato, cappuccino, latte, and finally, corretto. Macchiatos are essentially espresso with a little foamed milk on top, not quite the upside down latte many may think of today. Cappuccinos are traditionally espresso with foamy milk, but not quite as dry or foamy as some coffee shops make them today. And the corretto is espresso with a splash of liquor like grappa, sambuca, or brandy. At this time, Italy was getting most of its coffee from Africa and Brazil, meaning most of their blends contained some Robusta during this period. Still far less than a French cup of coffee, however, which on average contained around 75% Robusta. Unlike brewed coffee, espresso can pull intense flavors from lower grade coffee, including Robusta, which gives espresso a thicker looking crema. So, in the post war era, Brazil sold lower grade Santos beans to Italy. With the introduction of the moka pot in 1933, people could now make espresso at home. So, from the mid 50s to 70s, domestic consumption of espresso doubled in Italy. We used a mocha pot on episode 14, which is a form of percolator that makes a cup of espresso on your stovetop. Though it was advertised as being like espresso from the bar, it brews much slower and does not produce a crema layer. During the 1960s, Italy gained its first national coffee brand, Lavazza. The brand utilized cartoon TV ads and large distribution system to make their way into every home and store in the country. Returning to where it all started in Turin, Italy, Luigi Lavazza opened up shop in 1895. Later, Lavazza expanded their business and became a formal corporation shortly before the outbreak of World War II. Following the war, Luigi passed away in 1949, which was the same year the company opened a new branch in Milan, marking the beginning of their march towards national expansion. They used collectible coffee cards during the 50s and 60s, featuring themes like history, literature, and nature, as well as running their slogan, Lavazza is paradise in a cup. During this time, the company was operating under Luigi's three sons, quickly expanding into a large corporation. But by the mid 50s, the oldest brother, Mario, felt the company should tread in a more conservative manner, not overexpanding too quickly. However, his two younger brothers disagreed and forced Mario to sell his shares in the company to them so they could push the brand further into the global market. After this, they purchased a six-floor factory to manufacture their coffee and introduced vacuum cans for wider distribution. The other major Italian coffee brand of the time was Illy, a smaller company founded by Francisco Illy in 1933, but Italian coffee brands were still largely local roasters even by 1960, with around 2,000 such roasters. In post war Europe, Italian espresso machines made their way into the cafes of every major city, from Paris and Vienna to Amsterdam and Hamburg. Unlike England and the Americas, instant coffee was unable to find a consumer base in continental Europe, except for Switzerland, of course, home of Nestle. I say the Americas because, adding a touch of irony, Latin America was actually a large consumer of instant coffee, despite being the primary exporter of high grade coffee beans. Major European roasters began to dominate the world market, selling primarily whole bean coffee, as even pre ground canned coffee was less popular in Europe. Now, just because England enjoyed instant coffee doesn't mean the espresso craze didn't hit London. In fact, espresso culture took over London beginning in the early 50s. Post war London was not exactly the best place for cuisine, as rationing didn't end until 1954. Much of the city was still under reconstruction from bombings during the war, but as life began returning to normal, a new culture, driven by younger people in Soho, caused espresso to become popular. One of the first to bring about this culture was Italian immigrant Pino Reservato, who was tired of drinking poor quality coffee in London, much of which was chicory. So he opened a small coffee company to help introduce espresso. However, his initial attempt was in fact a complete failure, as no one was interested in trying this weird new foreign coffee. But Riservato pursued his idea anyway, opening the Mocha Bar in Soho in June of 1952. It was an instant sensation, serving 1,000 cups of coffee every day, beginning on opening day. Many immigrants from other parts of Europe and former veterans of the war were excited to be reunited with espresso. Brits tended to prefer cappuccinos, especially teenagers who began swapping it out for their tea. 4 years later, in 1956, there was something like 400 espresso bars in London. It wasn't long before coffee houses were serving almost exclusively handcrafted beverages rather than bulk brewed coffee. With espresso costing about twice as much as regular coffee, it was a very profitable drink for such establishments. These early British espresso bars were decorated similar to trending styles in the US, often with avant garde artwork, neon lights, potted plants, and apparently some even boasted actual parrots.
Cappuccino! Extra full!
This new coffee culture led people in Britain and the US to be more interested in coffee again, nearly pushing society out of the coffee dark age it had been in since World War II. I say nearly because instant coffee was still the primary way people made coffee at home in England and America. This was in part because Nestle and Maxwell House pushed instant coffee ads throughout the country during the period of tea rationing. Now, once the rationing came to an end in 1952, some believed it would revitalize tea culture, but it failed to spark any real change. Commercial television was introduced in the mid 50s, causing further problems for tea drinking. As we mentioned in a previous episode, this was because commercial breaks were too short to steep tea, but just the right length to make a cup of instant coffee. In response, tea companies came out with chopped up tea and put it into bags, which could quickly be brewed into a lesser quality cup of tea. This was not enough to hold back the rapid rise of coffee, however. While tea will continue to be the cultural image of Britain, coffee will rise in popularity over the coming decades, especially for home consumption. Like England in the mid 1950s, espresso began taking hold in parts of the United States, allowing customers to experience a taste of Europe. It sparked a small coffee house revival in parts of New York, and in San Francisco, it led to the beginning of espresso coffee culture on the West Coast. It was another Italian, Giovanni Giotta, who opened Cafe Triste in San Francisco's Little Italy district. Soon, stores began selling steam pressure, stovetop coffee makers, and before long, roasters began offering espresso blends. Sam Schonborn was one of the first on the scene. Already known for his coffee brand Savorin, he came up with the new brand, Medaglia d'Oro, a dark roasted, finely ground coffee for at-home espresso making. Another influence of Italian coffee culture in the United States came from the company Grafeo Coffee. Initially founded in 1935 by Giovanni Grafeo, a Sicilian immigrant to San Francisco. It was later acquired by another Italian, also named Giovanni, this time Giovanni Repetto. And it wasn't just Italian businesses, as American brands were also pushing for coffee to be like it was before the Dark Age. Such as another company out of San Francisco, Fried, Teller and Fried, who kept with the tradition of roasting Arabica beans in the old burn-style roaster. This led one journalist to describe the experience as, quote, like stepping into a time machine, end quote. Closing out our episode, I want to talk about the story of another coffee roaster from Europe who set up shop in the Bay Area. Over in the Netherlands, a coffee company called B. Korn & Co. was purchased by a man named Henry in 1908 and subsequently turned into a family business. While this coffee company may not be all that historically significant, it was his son, Alfred, who grew up working in his father's coffee shop that we care about. That's because Alfred would eventually move to California and open up a cafe using his last name, Pete. And while that alone is significant, as Pete's Coffee will help start a coffee revival in the U.S., Pete's Coffee in Berkeley would give 3 men their start in the art of coffee and roasting. Those 3 men would take that knowledge to Seattle and, with the blessing of Alfred Pete, start a little coffee company called Starbucks. I had originally intended for this episode to be on the history of coffee in Europe, but espresso ended up having such a rich history that it deserved its own episode. So I have decided to use episode 30 as a place to cover coffee in Europe. This means instead of our usual recap episode, we will be taking a more broad look at coffee in Europe, allowing me the chance to use some of my old notes, which never made it into any episode. So stay tuned for European coffee history in 2 episodes' time. This show is written and produced by me, Eric Zaffer. If you have not already, please consider supporting this podcast series on Patreon. For the price of a quad espresso a month, you can support this and future projects in this series, while getting access to members' episodes, transcripts of the show, and a chance to win merch. Speaking of merch, it's that time of year again to start thinking about holiday presents for family and friends who love coffee. Or more likely, you there listening want something. So when you're asked, what do you want this year? You can tell them to pick you up something from our merch site to support your favorite podcast on coffee history. Make sure to join our community on social media at the Complete History Podcast series. If you would like to contact us, you can message us through social media or at our email, completehistorypod@gmail.com. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on, and make sure to share it with your family and friends. To close, here's a quote which has been used in relation to the original espresso machine by Angelo Moriando. Espresso carries the intense aroma and the soul of the coffee into the cup.